The tragic fate of George Drouillard, a frontier legend in the vast and untamed wilderness of what is now Montana. The Jefferson River carved its path through pristine landscapes. Named after President Thomas Jefferson, the river was more than just a geographical feature. It symbolized the profound complexities of the American frontier in the early 19th century. This was a region where European explorers, fur trappers, and indigenous peoples interacted in a delicate balance of trade, negotiation, and often violent conflict. The river embodied both the promises of expansion and the perils of collision between cultures. It was along the Jefferson River that George Drouillard, a remarkable yet ultimately tragic figure of this era, met his untimely death. In 1810, Drouillard, renowned for his role as a mixed-race frontiersman and an indispensable member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, was killed in a confrontation with warriors from the Blackfoot Confederacy. His death marked not only the end of a storied life, but also the stark realities of a frontier embroiled in cultural tensions. Drouillard's life and demise reflected the larger forces at play. The westward expansion of the United States, driven by the ideology of manifest destiny, and the determined resistance of indigenous nations striving to defend their sovereignty. The Jefferson River, with its abundant resources of water, fish, and fertile soil, became a meeting point of civilizations, a crossroads where Euro-American ambitions for land and commerce clashed with the long-standing traditions of the Blackfoot and other native tribes who had lived in harmony with the land for centuries. As explorers and settlers moved westward, the river's role evolved. It transformed from a lifeline of sustenance for indigenous communities into a channel for trade, exploration, and eventual conquest. Drouillard's death along these waters epitomized the collision of two worlds, one characterized by relentless expansion and another rooted in ancestral stewardship of the land. The legacy of George Drouillard is inseparable from this broader narrative of exploration, resistance, and cultural upheaval. While his contributions to the Lewis and Clark expedition cemented his place in history, his fate along the Jefferson River remains a somber reminder of the sacrifices and conflicts that shaped the American frontier. The transformative forces of the American frontier. The story of George Drouillard, these westward movements were not without significant resistance, particularly from indigenous tribes who had long inhabited these lands and cultivated a profound connection with the natural environment that settlers sought to exploit and control. George Drouillard's story unfolds not merely as a personal tragedy, but as part of a larger narrative about the transformative forces shaping the American frontier. His life and death encapsulate a tale of exploration, violence, cultural misunderstanding, and the relentless fight for control over land and resources. A frontier in flux. The context of Drouillard's era. To grasp the significance of George Drouillard's death and his role in the history of the American frontier, it is essential to understand the broader historical context of the early 19th century. This was a period of monumental change, driven by expansionist ambitions, economic interests, and intense geopolitical competition. The United States, having recently secured its independence, was eager to extend its influence westward. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which effectively doubled the nation's size, opened vast, uncharted territories to exploration and settlement. This acquisition was driven by President Thomas Jefferson's vision of an agrarian republic, which would have profound and often devastating consequences, not just for the United States, but for the indigenous nations who had stewarded these lands for millennia. In the years following the Louisiana Purchase, settlers, traders, and explorers flooded into the newly acquired territories. Yet, these lands were far from empty. Indigenous peoples, such as the Blackfoot Confederacy, had lived in these regions for thousands of years. Their societies were deeply intertwined with the land, its animals, and the natural rhythms of the environment. The arrival of settlers and fur traders disrupted these societies in myriad ways. The expansionist impulses of the United States, bolstered by its growing economic interests in the fur trade, heightened tensions between the U.S. government, its settlers, and indigenous populations. The fur trade, which had long been a vital economic activity for both European settlers and indigenous peoples, became the driving force behind much of this westward push. The demand for beaver pelts, fueled by European fashion trends, spurred a race to exploit the natural wealth of the western frontier. Companies like the Missouri Fur Company, which George Drouillard joined in the early 1800s, sought to dominate the fur trade by encroaching into territories historically occupied by indigenous nations. Resistance and survival. The indigenous perspective, these incursions were met with fierce resistance from indigenous groups, particularly powerful confederacies like the Blackfoot, who fought to defend their territories and way of life. This resistance was often mischaracterized in the dominant narrative of the time, which framed it as a clash between the forces of civilization and the so-called savagery of indigenous peoples. Yet for the Blackfoot and other indigenous communities, this struggle was not simply about cultural differences. It was a fight for survival. The fur trade represented more than economic competition. It was an existential threat to their autonomy, their cultural heritage, and their deeply rooted connection to the land. The arrival of fur traders and settlers disrupted ecosystems, introduced diseases, and sparked violent conflicts, all of which upended indigenous ways of life. The life of George Drouillard. A man between worlds, George Drouillard was born in 1773 in Detroit, Michigan, to a French-Canadian father, Pierre Drouillard, and a Shawnee mother. His mixed heritage positioned him uniquely in the frontier world, bridging the cultural divide between Euro-American settlers and indigenous communities. Drouillard's dual identity allowed him to navigate both worlds with skill and insight. As an interpreter, hunter, and tracker, he played a pivotal role in the Lewis and Clark expedition, where his knowledge of indigenous languages and customs proved invaluable. Yet, this same duality placed him in a precarious position as the frontier became increasingly contested. Drouillard's death in 1810 at the hands of Blackfoot warriors was emblematic of the broader tensions of the time. It was not merely the loss of an individual, but a stark reminder of the violence and upheaval that defined the American frontier. His life and legacy remain intertwined with the complex history of expansion, resistance, and cultural transformation that shaped the United States during its formative years. George Drouillard. A bridge between cultures, George Drouillard's unique heritage equipped him with the skills and perspectives necessary to thrive on the American frontier. His father, Pierre Drouillard, a soldier, fur trader, and interpreter, instilled in him an appreciation for language and cultural understanding. His Shawnee mother provided him with knowledge of indigenous traditions and wisdom. Together, they gave George a distinctive perspective on the frontier, where diverse cultures coexisted and often clashed. From a young age, George exhibited exceptional abilities that served him well in the wilds of the American West. He became an expert hunter, trapper, and tracker, but his linguistic talents were perhaps his most valuable asset. Fluent in French, English, Shawnee, and the Plains Indian Sign Language, which served as a lingua franca among many indigenous peoples, Drouillard's ability to bridge cultural divides made him an invaluable member of the Lewis and Clark expedition. The Lewis and Clark expedition, Drouillard's vital role. By 1804, when the Lewis and Clark expedition set out, the United States was still a fledgling nation. Following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the government sought to explore its newly acquired territories, map uncharted lands, and establish peaceful relations with the indigenous peoples who inhabited them. Led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, the expedition aimed to achieve these goals, and George Drouillard was enlisted as a hunter and interpreter. Drouillard's contributions were pivotal to the expedition's success. His exceptional skills as a tracker and hunter ensured the group was well fed, even in challenging conditions. Meanwhile, his ability to communicate effectively with various indigenous nations helped foster diplomacy and goodwill. Often sent ahead as a scout, Drouillard played a crucial role in navigating the rugged terrain and avoiding potential threats. Despite his indispensable role, Drouillard's name has not achieved the same level of recognition as Lewis or Clark. This oversight reflects a broader historical tendency to downplay the contributions of individuals of indigenous or mixed heritage whose efforts were critical to shaping the narrative of the American frontier. The allure and dangers of the fur trade following the expedition. Drouillard turned his skills to the fur trade, a perilous and demanding industry that drew men into remote and often hostile territories. By 1810, Drouillard had joined the Missouri Fur Company, led by the prominent trader Manuel Lisa. With his deep knowledge of the land, linguistic proficiency, and tracking expertise, Drouillard became a key figure in the company's efforts to expand into the Rocky Mountains. The fur trade, however, was fraught with danger. Trappers, often referred to as mountain men, operated in isolated and unpredictable environments, contending with wild animals, harsh weather, and the resistance of indigenous groups. For the Blackfoot Confederacy, a powerful alliance of the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani nations, the encroachment of fur traders was not merely an economic threat, it was an existential one. The Blackfoot viewed trappers as invaders, disrupting their way of life and the ecological balance of their lands. These indigenous nations, known for their military strength and fierce defense of their territories, resisted European and American encroachment with tenacity. For Drouillard, operating in Blackfoot-controlled territory was particularly hazardous. A tragic end. George Drouillard's independent spirit often led him into dangerous and uncharted areas. In 1810, during a fur trading expedition along the Jefferson River, he encountered Blackfoot warriors. This meeting proved fatal. Drouillard's death underscored the perilous nature of the fur trade and the escalating conflicts between indigenous sovereignty and American expansionism. The Blackfoot Confederacy. Guardians of the Plains. The Blackfoot Confederacy was one of the most formidable indigenous alliances of the northern Great Plains. Comprised of the Siksika, Kainai, Blood, and Piikani nations, the Confederacy controlled vast territories spanning modern-day Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. Their lands were rich in resources, and their societies were deeply interconnected with the rhythms of the natural world. For centuries, the Blackfoot had thrived in these regions, maintaining a balanced relationship with the land. However, the arrival of fur traders and settlers disrupted this equilibrium. The Blackfoot's resistance to encroachment was not simply a matter of territorial defense. It was a fight to preserve their sovereignty, culture, and way of life. The Blackfoot, guardians of land and tradition, the Blackfoot Confederacy held a profound spiritual connection to their land and the animals that sustained them, particularly the bison. These majestic creatures were central to their way of life, providing food, clothing, shelter, and tools essential for survival. The Blackfoot were also renowned horsemen and warriors, skilled not only in combat but also in diplomacy, enabling them to navigate complex alliances and conflicts. When the United States began expanding westward, the Blackfoot saw the arrival of settlers, traders, and trappers as an existential threat. The fur trade disrupted their traditional hunting grounds, and the influx of European goods, such as firearms and metal tools, altered the balance of power among indigenous groups. Determined to defend their sovereignty, the Blackfoot launched a determined resistance against those who sought to exploit their resources and encroach upon their lands. The tensions between the Blackfoot and fur traders extended beyond economic concerns. For the Blackfoot, the fur trade was a direct assault on their way of life, their spiritual connection to the land, and their autonomy. Trappers were not seen as mere traders, but as representatives of a broader invasion, an encroaching force that sought to impose a foreign way of life on their ancestral territories. George Drouillard's final expedition in the spring of 1810. George Drouillard embarked on what would become his final journey. His plan was to trap along the Jefferson River, a route he had traveled many times during his years in the fur trade. However, this time the stakes were higher. The Blackfoot, already known for their hostility toward outsiders, had grown increasingly vigilant in defending their territory against intruders. Despite the risks, Drouillard remained undeterred. His confidence stemmed from his extensive experience, his deep knowledge of the land, and his understanding of indigenous peoples. He trusted in his abilities to navigate the perils of this hostile terrain. When Drouillard failed to return to camp after several days, his companions became alarmed. A search party was organized, and after several days, They discovered his lifeless body near a creek. Evidence at the scene indicated that Drouillard had been ambushed by Blackfoot warriors. Although the exact circumstances of his death remain unclear, it is widely believed that he was killed in a violent struggle with his attackers. The scene suggested that Drouillard had fought valiantly, but he was ultimately overpowered. A loss for the frontier. George Drouillard's death was a profound loss, not only for his companions, but for the broader frontier community. He was more than a skilled trapper and hunter. He was a cultural bridge. His fluency in multiple languages, his deep understanding of indigenous customs, and his unparalleled knowledge of the land made him an invaluable figure during a transformative period in American history. Drouillard's passing marked the end of an era. The frontier was a place of immense opportunity, but also one fraught with danger and uncertainty. His story serves as a reminder of the complex and often tragic dynamics of cultural exchange, conflict, and survival that defined the American frontier. A life cut short, a legacy. Remember, George Drouillard's contributions to the Lewis and Clark expedition and the American frontier have often been overshadowed by the towering figures of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Yet his role was no less critical. As a skilled interpreter, hunter, and tracker, Drouillard's expertise ensured the expedition's survival in the face of the harsh realities of the frontier. His death in 1810, while tragic, highlighted both the dangers of life on the edge of the expanding American frontier and the fraught relationships between Euro-Americans and indigenous peoples. Although Drouillard never achieved the fame of his more celebrated contemporaries, his life is a testament to the challenges, complexities, and contradictions of the frontier. He was a man uniquely equipped to navigate both the European and indigenous worlds, using his knowledge and finesse to bridge the gap between these often opposed cultures. His untimely death, caught between the forces of American expansion and indigenous resistance, was a poignant reflection of the tensions that defined his life. A life lived on the margins of two worlds, expanding the legacy, broader themes, and lessons. The story of George Drouillard extends beyond the life of a single individual. His mixed heritage, service to both the U.S. government and indigenous groups, and eventual death at the hands of the Blackfoot Confederacy underscore the larger conflicts that defined the American frontier. At its core, Drouillard's story is about the collision of cultures, one driven by expansion and the other by resistance. It illustrates the exploitation of natural resources, the disruption of indigenous ways of life, and the enduring tension between economic opportunity and cultural survival. These themes are not confined to history books. They resonate deeply in the modern world. Drouillard's legacy compels us to confront the consequences of imperialism, colonization, and the unchecked exploitation of natural resources. His life invites us to reflect on the costs of progress and the price of ambition. Importantly, it reminds us that the history of the American frontier was not solely shaped by those who pushed westward, but also by the indigenous peoples who fought valiantly to preserve their lands and cultures. A tragic hero of the frontier, George Drouillard stands as a symbol of the contradictions and complexities of the American frontier. His life was one of bravery, resilience, and skill, but also of profound tragedy. His death marked the end of a life spent navigating the precarious balance between two worlds and highlighted the broader forces of history. Forces that shaped the land, its people, and the future of a nation. As we reflect on Drouillard's life, we are reminded of the inherent challenges of the frontier, the intricacies of cultural exchange, and the lasting impact of westward expansion on indigenous peoples. His story is not merely the tale of one man's journey. It is a reflection of the larger history of the American West. In the end, George Drouillard's life and death serve as a reminder of the multifaceted nature of history and the enduring legacies of those who lived on society's margins. His passing was a tragic loss to those who knew him, but his life's narrative stands as a compelling symbol of survival, knowledge, and understanding in a world undergoing rapid and often devastating change.